Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. My name is Daniel Cantey. This episode follows on our discussion of priestly concerns and the sacrificial cult that we have seen in the latter chapters of Exodus and in Leviticus. So we talked about the story of the golden calf. We then talked about the temple or the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrifices. Then we talked about further priestly concerns like categories of clean and unclean and holy and unholy. This is the background for our discussion tonight, or in this episode, which I have entitled The Modern Idolatry. And so what I'm going to do in this particular episode is talk about how particular religious developments that I've already discussed in earlier lectures can be seen through the lens of idolatry and can actually help explain, I think, certain religious phenomena that we have seen in the modern world. And by the modern world, I mean roughly the last 500 years since the Reformation here in the West. Now, what religious phenomena am I talking about more specifically? First, the breakdown of the church into various denominations and sects. So you hear, for example, in the United States in the 20th and 21st century that supposedly there are thousands of denominations that have sprung up, and we have the phenomenon of non-denominational churches at this point, as well as people who say that they believe in Jesus and they have their Bible, but they don't really need to go to church. You have that kind of phenomenon in which the church is broken apart into all of these different pieces. So you have the breakdown, or the scattering, as I would call it, of the church. You also have apostasy, where people have walked away from the faith in the West. And what I'm trying to do here is ask, hypothesize, if you will, whether or not there is a kind of idolatry at the heart of Western Christianity in the last 500 years or so that provides a template for what has happened. Think about it as a kind of DNA or a kind of model for this breakdown of the church in the West that has in fact occurred. The argument that I'm going to make here, leaning on the lectures that I gave at the end of Exodus, where we discussed the Exodus event and modernity over the course of 2 lectures, I'm going to take some of the lessons that we culled from that, some of the patterns that we saw in the Exodus, and look at them through the lens of idolatry, and see how it is that they might apply or give us a way of thinking about what has happened to the church in the modern West. So, you can probably already guess at this point that this lecture is going to sound rather polemical, that I'm going to be pointing the finger at developments in Protestantism in particular, a little bit less so in Catholicism, but more directly in Protestantism. And I want to say that while that is the case, while I will be saying that the understanding of Christ in the West, particularly the Protestant understanding of Christ, that understanding developed in light of the doctrine of justification by faith alone, I'm going to be saying that that understanding of Christ is idolatrous. And so while I am saying that, I want to say that I'm not doing it in a polemical spirit. I'm not trying to get up on a soapbox or from a place where I can be haughty or arrogant and point the finger and say, these are all the folks that have it wrong, but we've got it right. I really am not trying to do that. If you've been following along with this lecture series from the start, you've probably guessed that whenever I talk about the modern world or developments in the modern world or the structures of modern existence, my main goal is to try to understand what is going on around us. Not really to point the finger at one or another group. I'm really just trying to understand what has happened in modernity. And this lecture is no different. So if we look at the Western Church and we see that it has broken down countless times, and we see that after several centuries there is a prominent vector towards apostasy, more and more people have apostatized from religion in general, not just Christianity, then we can ask the question, where has this come from? Why has it come about in the West? In what way might Western Christianity actually have contributed to it? And so while, again, what I have to say is going to sound very polemical, or it's going to sound polemical in content, my presentation of it, I hope, will not be. It's not meant, again, to be something said from a position of arrogance or self-righteousness. On the other hand, there are reasons that I am Orthodox. I'm sure there are reasons for all of you here in the audience who are Orthodox. I'm sure that there are reasons that you are, and that you are an adherent of this understanding of the Christian faith as opposed to one of the Western ones. And so again, while I'm not trying to be polemical in spirit, at the same time, I do want to give those who are Orthodox some confidence for maintaining that path, as opposed to being outside of orthodoxy and following one of the other paths that claim the name of Christian here in the modern world. Now, before I get into this understanding of salvation, and particularly the understanding of Christ that is at the heart of it, I want to say something about the category of idolatry, because it's kind of a unique one in the modern world. When you hear Orthodox people or Western folks as well, and when I'm thinking of Western people, I'm thinking of Western academics, some of whom are religious, operating in secular contexts at universities. Some of them may be leaders of churches in the West, Protestant and Catholic. When they talk about the religious landscape, typically you hear words like heresy. Well, maybe there are churches out there that if they're not like us, they're heresies. You don't have to be Orthodox to talk about heresies that are outside of our church. There are plenty of Catholics who would say, well, folks outside of the Catholic Church are heretics. Or there would be plenty of Protestants who say people who aren't like us are heretics. This is kind of a common category that's used. Another common category that's used is secularism. So the idea is that there is now this realm called the secular, and the realm of the secular is outside of the church. People have now begun to understand themselves outside of religion, whether that's institutionalized religion or whether that's religion seen in the heart, for example. And in fact, Charles Taylor, one of the authors that I mentioned way back in the introduction, he wrote a book published in 2007 called A Secular Age, which was this massive tome about the nature and forms of religion in the modern world. And one of the ways that he understands secular has to do with the transformation in the necessity of religious belief from the year, say, 1500 up to the year 2000. Because in the year 1500, if you were born in the West, it was assumed that you were going to be Christian, that you were going to be a member of a church. And prior to the Reformation, that would be the Catholic Church. And so you were going to understand your existence through that faith. And that was an assumed aspect of your life. But here we are 500 years later, the year 2000, around the time he's writing this book, and that is no longer the case. Now you have choices about whether or not you are to be religious. Religion is one option among many, and you find that if you are going to be religious, that you in fact have several options about how you are going to do so. And so secularity in this particular sense has to do with the opening up of religious possibilities. You are no longer by necessity someone who has to identify with the Christian faith as you are born into a Christian civilization. Now you are born into a different kind of civilization, a secular one, a one where it is completely normal for you to live your life outside of the dictates or the restrictions, we say, that might be placed on you by any religion or worship of any god. And so secularism is a pretty large category when it comes to Western academics. There's also the notion of apostasy, which is closely related to this, which is the idea that civilization may get past religion in general, and that people have walked away from the church as a part of this. So by apostasy, I mean that people who would be Christian are no longer Christian. In fact, they are outside of the church, or they have abdicated the Christian faith in some way. And secularism and apostasy are pretty closely tied together, I think. Apostasy, by the way, is a religious category. It's not one that Western academics tend to use when they have conversations about religion in the modern world. They tend to stick to secularism. Again, apostasy is something that religious leaders will use when they look at society, and they may say that it's apostate, meaning that it has fallen away from God, in particular the Christian God. But these categories, heresy, secularism, apostasy, while they may provide good descriptions of portions of the modern world, they're not the category of idolatry. Idolatry is a different category. It's not one, as far as I am aware, that people who are observers of the modern West have used. I'm not aware of a major prominent thinker, whether Orthodox or outside of the Orthodox world, pointing at a particular religion or, say, other brand of Christianity and saying this is fundamentally idolatry. So there may be one that's out there, but I don't know that that kind of thought has had influence over the way that folks leading the churches in the West think about what has happened. But we're coming out of the context of the Pentateuch, and the major sin in the Pentateuch that we have seen is idolatry. Idolatry is arguably the major sin of the Old Testament. It is mentioned as many times as any other sin. Over and over, we see warnings to Israel not to be idolaters. That's not to say that it's the only major sin, but it is one of the biggest, if not the biggest. And I want to say that throughout the Old Testament, if we go outside the Pentateuch, we see a consistent emphasis on idolatry. So if we look at the canonical prophets, and by canonical I mean prophets that have books named after them, we see a consistent current of emphasis on idolatry, whether we're reading the major prophets or the minor prophets. So just to give a couple of examples, the prophet Ezekiel focuses prominently on idolatry when he predicts the coming of the army of Babylon to destroy Jerusalem. He has visions of sins in the temple in Jerusalem, and these are idolatrous visions or visions of idolatry that the people are participating in. And this idolatry is central to how Ezekiel understands the sin of Israel. Ezekiel is a great prophet to go to if you're looking for a prophet with priestly concerns and concerns that have a very, very strong emphasis on worship. So he's one example. Another example of a canonical prophet is Hosea. Hosea was a prophet to the northern kingdom, and his prophecies make very good use of what's called the marriage metaphor. And in this case, Israel is the wife, God is the husband, and they are supposed to be faithful to one another. But Israel has been unfaithful. Israel has been an adulteress. And the adultery in this case means that Israel has gone after other gods. And so idolatry is the sin that is equated with adultery, and it is this idolatry primarily that the people are to be punished for. So we see this sin in the canonical prophets. There are several other examples. I just wanted to give a couple. Even in the non-canonical prophets, for example, in Elijah, who is seen in Kingdoms, he has his battle against the prophets of Baal, where they build their altars, and there's a contest to see which god will have fire come down from heaven and consume the sacrifice. And so God does this for Elijah, and he wins the contest, and all the prophets of Baal, who are the prophets of this other god, they are defeated. So we see idolatry as a kind of contest there in Kingdoms, in addition to the examples that I've given in the canonical prophets. When we think of the prophets in general, by the way, there are two major sins that they focus on. The first is idolatry. The second that is behind it is oppression or mistreatment of the poor. And you can break these two sins down to, I think, the two major commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. If you're not loving God, the main way that you're not doing it in the Old Testament is to go after other gods, to be an idolater. And if you want to look at this through the lens of rest, you're not resting in God. You're trying to find your rest in other gods. This is one of, again, the major repeated sins in the Old Testament. The second, love your neighbor as yourself. If you're going to sin against that, then you're going to oppress or burden your neighbor. Remember, if you're going to love your neighbor, that means you're relieving that person's burdens or that you are giving them rest. You're lightening their burdens. And so these are the two big sins that we see in the Old Testament prophets, but I want to focus here on idolatry. This is the background for us when we look tonight, or we look in this episode rather, at how idolatry might fit into the modern world and what the consequences of that idolatry are for the religious developments that I mentioned earlier, the breakdown of the church and apostasy. So, what is the modern idolatry? Let's step back here in beginning to the model that we have seen in Exodus, the story of Exodus. Well, the people are enslaved in Egypt, but not only are they enslaved, they are ruthlessly oppressed. Things are very bad for them. They have to make bricks without straw. They have no rest. The Pharaoh denies them rest. And so they are under what I have called an infinite law, a law that is inescapable in its tyranny and in its brutality, a law that cries out for them to be liberated from it, a law that does not start or stop, that is always with them, always placing the burden upon them. And so they are liberated from this kind of law. They are freed from it. But this freedom is not for the sake of freedom. Very soon after this, we find them at Sinai. And at Sinai, they receive another kind of law. This is a law that is merciful, a law that limits itself, a law that, most importantly, has sacrifice built into it. So here you have a law in which the commands, which are what we are supposed to do, or in this case, what the ancient Israelites were supposed to do, are balanced with the sacrifices, which is what God does. It's with the sacrifices that the people are supposed to rest. And we have seen now throughout the law in Exodus and Leviticus when the people are supposed to rest. And so rest is very prominent in this. You have a law that is merciless under the Pharaoh in which there is no rest. Then you have the liberation from that law. And then you are given over, as an ancient Israelite, to a new law which is merciful because it provides space for rest. So to think about this, step back a little bit and think about it from a broader perspective. You've got Israel under the law, a break of freedom, or we might say actually a period of rest from that law before they go to another law. But the shift is from the infinite and merciless law to a law that is merciful. So the shift is from a law, again, that provides no opportunity for rest, but which is what we might call a totalizing burden, something that tyrannizes them, from that to another kind of burden, a yoke that is easy and a burden that is light, to borrow the words from the Christ, because the law has rest built into it. Now, given this as our background, what can we say about the Christian mode of salvation? And here I'm talking about the day-to-day life of an individual Christian. How does this work? And I'm assuming at this point that the Christian is a member of the Orthodox Church. So I'm within the Orthodox tradition here, talking about how the spiritual life works. Well, the Christian life begins, in this brief snapshot that I'm giving, with the Christian under the law. But the law is merciful. From the starting point, the law is merciful. Sacrifice is built into it. And so what this means is that you can start along the law. Let's say it's Monday and you're going through your week, and you try to be obedient to the law, which means that you try to stay away from sins of thought, word, and deed, and you try to love your neighbor as yourself. If you see a neighbor who is burdened, you try to meet that burden. You try to relieve them. You try to help others that you see who are going through hard circumstances and difficulties, while at the same time keeping yourself away from those things that you know will draw you away from God. Whatever those temptations might be, you struggle against your passions. You struggle against wicked and deceptive and evil thoughts of various kinds. You struggle against vices, pride, lust, gluttony, self-indulgence, whatever they may be. You struggle against these things, and so you are trying to obey the law with the assumption that it is a merciful law all along. But inevitably, we fail. All of us fail quite a bit. And so we know that our struggle is not sufficient. We know we are in no way able to save ourselves. And so we come to the sacrifice at the liturgy. And at the sacrifice in the liturgy, we request as sinners humbly for remission of sins and for the grace of eternal life, so that the sins that we have committed will be covered by the sacrifice in which we mystically partake as we take the Eucharist, that we ingest Christ there mystically present in the sacrifice, in the ritual, in the sacrament. And so we do this that our sins may be covered, but also that we will have grace to return to the law. We rest in the efficacy of what Christ has done, knowing that what he has done is enough. And again, the entirety of the sermon of Hebrews is making this point. What Christ has done on the cross and in the resurrection is enough. We can rest in this. It will give us salvation. And so we struggle before we come to the sacrifice. We rest in the sacrifice. And then we return to the struggle. We go back to the law, having rested and therefore refreshed, and having confidence that Christ will be with us. And so Christ's sacrifice in this instance is rest in the context of a merciful law, remission of sin, and grace to struggle. And this we can imagine as a cycle, because really this is what it is. It is a life in which the interweaving of law and sacrifice ideally will drive us toward holiness, toward theosis. The idea is that as we continue to receive the grace of Christ in the sacrament, that we actually become, ideally, a little bit better in our struggle. That we cease to be the slaves to sin that we once were, and that we can come to something like theosis, that we can come to a state in which God is dwelling within us. Not that people, not that even saints, come to a notion of sinlessness. We don't say that, but that's the direction in which they are moving. That sin no longer reigns over them. They now have a communion with God such that God dwells within them, and their obedience to the law has become a regular part of their lives. And so there's actual progress over the course of a life towards sanctification and holiness, and the experience of the grace of God, both in the sacrament as well as in one's daily life. Now, I want to add here that in addition to the Eucharist, there is the daily experience of prayer, where Christians, can attempt to rest in the presence of God. So in addition to Sunday, when you go to the liturgy and you participate in the sacrifice, you have your struggle with the law throughout the day, all day on Monday, say. But perhaps in this example, you come to Christ at night in your prayer, and you try to draw near to him there in silence and in stillness, away from worldly cares, that you can turn yourself to him and rest in his presence, knowing that he is near. And so the cycle is not only weekly, but we could say daily. You struggle with the law, you rest in the presence of God in prayer, and this rejuvenates you. It gives you refreshment so that you can again return to the law and struggle the next day. This is part of the reason that daily prayers are important, to seek God, to dwell in his presence, to rest in him after seeking to live an obedient life throughout the day, or perhaps the day prior, whether you pray in the morning or in the evening. But there is this kind of cycle that should lead, at least in theory, it's supposed to lead for us, towards sanctification, so that those who are dedicated to it and who are genuinely seeking the grace of God can progress toward sainthood. And again, the meaning of Christ's sacrifice in this particular context is rest in the context of a merciful law. So you have struggle with the merciful law, which we inevitably fail before. Then you have rest in the sacrifice of Christ, and then a return to that merciful law. This is the way that salvation is supposed to work. But if this is the way salvation is supposed to work, what then is the way of idolatry? How is it different? How does it give a different way of salvation? How is the meaning of Christ differently lived? Not necessarily differently understood, but differently lived. Now, before I get to this in the Protestant context, because here I'm going to go to Luther, I want to hear what he has to say about how the Christian life is supposed to work. Well, for him, you come under the law as something that terrorizes you, as something that oppresses you. You learn at the height of the oppression and terror that you come under the law in your experience, and at the height of that experience. Then you say, nothing that I can do will save me, no work of mine has anything to do with my salvation, and so you turn completely away from the law to Christ, and you accept salvation or justification by faith alone. And after you receive this particular kind of grace, according to Luther, then you can return to the law joyously. You can return to the law no longer afraid of its ability to terrify, no longer afraid of its ability to condemn, that you can actually be obedient out of the joy that's in your heart because Christ has liberated you from the curse of the law. Now, that's the way Luther would describe the Christian life, and the way he does describe it in places in his writings. I think that if you're paying attention, you can already see how things are different for Luther. But I want to walk through how things are different according to this doctrine of justification by faith alone. When you come under the law, to start with, from the beginning, clearly you are not coming under a law that is merciful. You're not coming under the law at Sinai. You're coming under the law of the Pharaoh, a law that gives you no rest, a law that produces an extreme anxiety, a law that is constantly there to accuse and condemn you. This law is there as a whip. It's there almost to punish you, certainly to terrify you. That this is what the law is meant to do. This is a law, importantly, again, that excludes rest, that is tyrannical and oppressive. And so you move from this law to the grace of Christ. And the point of the grace of Christ is to liberate you from the law's terror, from the law's curse. And this liberation has to do with the realization that you don't have to obey the law to be saved. That your obedience to the law has nothing to do with your salvation. It is completely a matter of faith. And so the law is annulled insofar as it is significant for salvation. It is not a saving thing. It no longer counts. It is dissolved as salvific. It doesn't carry the kind of weight or the kind of meaning or significance that it otherwise would have. When it comes to salvation, the law has nothing to say. So you are liberated from the law. You are liberated from its terror, liberated from its curse, but also, and this is me interpreting Luther, you are liberated from its significance, liberated from the claim that it makes on you. And so then, according to Luther, you return to the law, and you can do so joyously. But I think it's very important to understand the nature of the law to which you are returning. You are not, in this particular case, liberated from the law of the Pharaoh in order to return, or in order to progress, rather, to Sinai, to a law that has mercy built into it. Rather, what you are doing, and Luther, I think, would admit this, is that you are liberated from the law of the Pharaoh, but when you return to the law, supposedly with joy, you are in fact returning back to the law of Pharaoh. But this law supposedly has no claim over you. So there is the infinite law that is merciless and oppressive, and you are liberated from that law by the grace of Christ, and then you return to the law that is tyrannical and oppressive. And so the liberation from the law that is nestled between, that is in the middle here, is something different. It's not something that gives rest according to a law that is merciful. It is rather a moment of freedom and annulment of a law that is unmerciful, a law that is tyrannical. And so what we have here is a different kind of sacrifice. Christ's sacrifice means liberation from a tyrannical law. It is an undermining of the significance of the law. It's not rest in the context of a merciful law that you then return to because God is merciful. It is liberation from a law that is, again, the law of the Pharaoh, tyrannical and oppressive. And so when you go back to that law, you don't go back to it as a source of mercy or as part of the way of salvation, but as something that is ultimately oriented towards the next moment of liberation. Think about it again as a cycle, that you come underneath the infinite law, the law of the Pharaoh. Then you are liberated from that law. But then when you go back to the law after experiencing the grace of Christ, you come back again under the infinite law. Even though you are supposed to come back to it joyously, even though it supposedly doesn't have the power to condemn you that it had before, you still go back to it, and it is fighting against you. To put it in terms of the Exodus story, some of you will remember how the people will complain to Moses at times and say, let's go back to Egypt. Things were better there. Now, arguably, this is what is actually happening in Luther's understanding of salvation. You're underneath the law of the Pharaoh in Egypt. You're liberated by the grace of Christ from that law. But instead of going to Sinai, you're going back to Egypt. And this is what you keep doing. This is the way the progression works. If you were to think about it over the course of an individual life, then you would have an individual who is underneath the law of the Pharaoh, then is liberated from that law. Then comes again underneath the law of the Pharaoh. And again, this is the law of God that we're talking about. This is the divine law. And so every time you come back to that law, you experience God as oppressive. You experience God, the lawgiver, as a tyrant in some form until Christ comes and liberates you. But you experience him as a tyrant, you're liberated from the law. Then you experience God as a tyrant, and then you're liberated from God's law by Christ. Then you experience God's law as a tyrant, and then you're liberated by God's law. Liberated from God's law, by Christ. Where does this leave progress in obedience? Where does it leave sanctification? Certainly there's no notion of theosis here. How is there progress in holiness when the law is continually being annulled? When the law is continually being denigrated and undermined by grace? This is grace against the law, not grace in harmony with the law to produce sanctification and righteousness. Here you have grace against the law to continually drive down its claim to power, to silence it, to suffocate it, as it were. Now, it's easier, I think, for us to think about the consequences of this cycle over the course of several centuries as opposed to the course of a single individual life. Over the course of a single individual life, indeed, it might be a little bit tougher to think what the consequences of this would actually look like in practice. But on the other hand, when we think about this particular dynamic or trajectory of salvation under the rubric of this, or under the umbrella rather, of this idolatrous Christ, this Christ that doesn't mean rest and return to the law, this Christ that means liberation from a law that is tyrannical, what would that look like over the course of several centuries? Well, let's start with the example of Luther. And what I'm going to do here is paint a sketch of what could happen over several centuries. It's not an exact sketch, but it will follow the general path of things that have happened in the modern West. So let's say that there is a person like Luther who comes to see the law of God and the divine law embodied in the church as something tyrannical and oppressive, which Luther certainly saw the law of the Catholic Church as. He certainly saw that law as these things. And so Luther, over the course of his theological battles, breaks from that law and ultimately breaks from the Catholic Church. Over the course of his theological disputes between, say, 1515 and 1520, he ends up separating himself pretty markedly from the Catholic Church here at the beginning of the Reformation. The pattern of his life, although he didn't set out necessarily for it to be this way, the pattern of his life is being underneath the infinite or oppressive law, the law of the Pharaoh, now identified with the law of the church, and liberation from that law. That is his salvation, to put quotes around that word. His salvation is to break away from Rome, just as the same way that his salvation of grace in Christ is to break away from divine law. And so he breaks away, and this is his salvation. And outside of the Protestant world that is generally favorable towards Luther, if you're a Catholic or if you're Orthodox, you look at this and you say, well, that's just schism. That's essentially what this is. But those who believe that the Reformation was right would say, no, this is a rediscovery of the way of God and the grace of Christ. This was something that was necessary. But this is the model that we see. And so imagine sometime not in the 1500s, but let's say in the 1600s or the 1700s, Any member of any Protestant denomination comes to see their denomination's rule and their denomination's law as somehow oppressive or somehow tyrannical or somehow limiting of human possibilities, most notably the possibility of knowing God, somehow deceived, somehow even demonic, as people during those centuries would throw that term around. You know, this person's the Antichrist, or that person is of the devil, or whatever the case may be. But they begin to see their own church as something oppressive. And so what do? What is the form of salvation that is at work here? If you're under an infinite or oppressive law, you break away. And so they leave the church that they were once in, and they go off to another church. And you have, again, a kind of schism on an individual level, people moving from one denomination to another, or one church to another, or one sect to another. If things are really wrong, then you go off and you start your own sect. This happened in many cases. If we fast forward to the 19th century in the United States of America, there were so many different sects and churches that there were members of the American society who literally went into their rooms and locked the door and read their Bible until they thought they had figured out the truth. What was oppressive, what was taking their rest at that point, was not the law of a particular church, but the proliferation of all of the different churches and sects, all saying that they were true, all saying that they were right, all saying that they had the proper path to God. And what we see has happened over the course of the West, in the story that I've told so far, is that a pattern of salvation in which God the lawgiver has essentially issued the law of the Pharaoh, and then this leads to liberation from that law in the grace of Christ. When we apply that pattern institutionally to the church, we have the DNA of repeated, if not unlimited, schism, of individuals breaking away again and again and again. Finally, until we get in the 19th and the 20th centuries, where more and more people break away from the church entirely. Where by that time, the society has adopted the notion that religion is backwards, that religion is pre-modern or Philistine or medieval or whatever you might want to call it, that it's certainly not a harbinger of progress, which all of the elites in Europe believed in the 19th century, that it's contrary to all of these things. If you want to be enlightened, if you want to be a kind of avant-garde member of your society, or if you want to be sophisticated, you have to let religion go. It is something that is restrictive of human possibilities in general. And so people, for one reason or another, walk away from the church. Now, I've given a sketch here of why people might leave churches. There are certain historical examples that will conform very well to the little sketch that I've drawn. There are other examples that may not. I'm not trying to say that this formula explains every time that there was a schism, or that explains every time someone walked away from Christianity and decided that they were going to apostatize. But what I am saying is that this form of salvation has been active at times in the history of the West since the Reformation, and that it provides a legitimation for schism. It provides a legitimation for the breakdown of the church, the undermining of the law of God as it is embodied from the church. Salvation is now to break away from that law. It is liberation from a law deemed as tyrannical, and that is the meaning of the sacrifice of Christ, which is a very different meaning from how it should properly be understood and lived. With Aaron, those in the West might say, "Here are your gods, O Israel, that brought you out of Egypt." And yet looking to the Christ who rescued them supposedly from the Catholic Church, or rescued them supposedly from whatever church was misled and brought them into their new denomination or their new sect, looking to that Christ, they have an idol in its place. An idol that looks a lot like Christ, but is not, in fact, the Christ. The striking thing about this, I think, about this form of idolatry, is its remarkable subtlety. The Reformers, Luther and Calvin, if not others, would have agreed entirely with the statements of the Council of Nicaea. They would have agreed entirely with the statements of the Council of Chalcedon on the nature of Christ. The major councils that have to do with Christology and the doctrine of God, they would have assented to. They would have had no problem with them. And just for disclosure for all of you, I was raised in the Presbyterian Church. We said the Nicene Creed every week. And yet this idolatry is so subtle that you can accept the creeds that are basic theologically for understanding God and not know that idolatry has slipped underneath the door, that it has in fact made its way in very surreptitiously, very secretly. And so rather than having a Christ who builds up the church and makes saints, who guides people by grace along the path of the law so that they can come to theosis, rather than this happening, what you have is a pattern for the continuous fracturing of the church of God. So that the body of Christ, if we could imagine it as a physical body, dies and sees the flesh break down into different chunks until finally it returns to dust. And people are outside of the church. They have apostatized, or they say to themselves, all I need is my Bible and Jesus, I'm good, I don't need to be in the church. And at that point, the body of Christ has fully dissolved, and it has returned to something indiscernible, it has become something indiscernible as his body. There is a different way of salvation at work here. There is a different Christ to be understood here. Next time, we will turn to Numbers. I will see you all then.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.